Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Mavrick Boejoekoe. I'm the chairman of the Youth Education and Leadership Foundation. I want to start off by thanking the American Embassy that financed this project and our international partner, Global American, who facilitated the ICT part, Professor Schalekuwijk and a team of speakers that did a very good job yesterday. We did have some technical difficulties yesterday, and my sincere apologies to the ambassador of the US and her having to wait due to an omission from our side, and also apologies to all the people, the listeners yesterday. So yesterday, the speakers, they focused on good governance and corruption more in the public sector. The different speakers talked about the root of corruption. Haiti was discussed, which scored very low on the corruption perception index. It's also one of the second poorest country in the region. Suriname was also discussed, who also has his own set of challenges. Some of the following questions were addressed. What is corruption? Is corruption an attribute of small societies? How do you recognize it? What are the main drivers of corruption in the Caribbean? One of the speakers emphasized the institutions like the CARICOM or CCG. Those institutions could play a greater role in the fight against corruption. The solution for this challenge was also seen in challenging the belief system, the norms and values of a society, and also emphasizing human rights, civic engagement in the educational system. Transparency of the government budget and government accountability were also seen as key drivers for good governance. Today, we will talk about corruption, oil, and the role of external actors in the Caribbean. Guy Mentel, Executive Director of Global Americans, who also helped us organize this conference, will be the moderator. Those who don't know Global Americans, please check them out at theglobalameriCans.org. Guy?
Mavrick, thank you so much for that very generous introduction and for all of your work here. Global Americans is thrilled to be co-sponsoring this two-day conference on good governance and corruption in the Caribbean. And we're very grateful to all who have attended one or both of these days. Special thanks to the U.S. Embassy in Suriname and Ambassador Karen Williams for her support for this project. As Mavrick mentioned, my name is Guy Mentel. I am the Executive Director of Global Americans. And as Mavrick mentioned, for those new to our organization, please find us at theglobalameriCans.org, where you'll find critical analysis on the region that seeks to broaden the discussion of the Americas and the Caribbean within the global context. We also, for those new to us, have a podcast that we invite you to share and check out, which is a joint venture with the Canadian Council for the Americas called Two Gringos with Questions. Recent interviewees have included Francis Fukuyama, New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark, anthropologist Wade Davis, and many more. And that podcast is easily accessible wherever you find your podcasts. I'd also like to announce here, with these wonderful panelists alongside me and with top experts in the audience, that Global Americans has recently launched a program called the Caribbean Corner, which again, you can find on our website. And there we will continue to churn out regular news and analysis on the Caribbean and on the important issues that we're discussing today, with many of the panelists here contributing to that work. So for today's event, we invite you to write questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I will be actively monitoring that box, and we'll try to incorporate those questions into the course of this conversation. Just a note though, we may or may not get to all of them due to time, but we do invite you to contact us in that way. Without further ado, I'm delighted to be joined by some of the top experts in the Caribbean and the energy space, and I'll briefly introduce each in turn, and then we'll just dive right into the Q&A section of this conversation. Rayah Bhattacharji is a sociologist and researcher working as a senior program manager at Projekta, and she's a member of the multi-stakeholder group of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative in Suriname. Projekta, as many in the audience will know, is one of the principal civil society organizations in Suriname advocating for good governance through a human rights-based approach. Scott MacDonald, who is embarrassing me with a much more impressive bookshelf behind him, is a chief economist at Smith's Research and Gradings. Before that, he worked as the head of research for an asset management company and served as international economic advisor at the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency in Washington, D.C. He has written extensively on international economic issues and geopolitical risk, with a particular focus on the Caribbean and Latin America. He's also, and we're proud to say, a research fellow at Global Americans, and he has a PhD in political science from the University of Connecticut. Bruce Zagaris is a partner in the Washington, D.C. law firm of Berliner, Corcoran, and Rowe, where he has represented many governments and international organizations in Latin America, and especially Brazil and the Caribbean, negotiating tax treaties, bilateral investment treaties, and proposing and drafting financial products to attract investment. Bruce appears regularly as a top expert witness in international tax, financial regulatory, and money laundering cases, and he has authored and edited 6 books and many law review articles. Last but certainly not least, we have Tony Bryan with us. Tony is a professor and senior fellow with the Institute of International Relations at the University of West Indies and a senior associate at CSIS in Washington, D.C. He's a leading scholar on regional security issues in Central America and the Caribbean, and an independent consultant on energy development, energy security, and energy geopolitics in the region. He is the author and editor of 10 books and numerous articles, and has received his PhD in Latin American history from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. So Tony is indeed a Cornhusker. We will start now with the Q&A section. I'm going to start with you, Scott. And maybe if you'd like to just open by setting the stage for us a little bit as to how we ought to interpret corruption in this context, its size, its scope, perhaps how it manifests. Is it primarily manifested in the sorts of contracts negotiated and the provisions inserted therein, or in more subtle ways? And lastly, how can governments deal with this in a more robust fashion in terms of investment and direct investment? And to that, I turn to Scott.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Guy. And I'd like to thank everybody for pulling this conference together, in particular, Mavrick. It was a lot of work, but I think it's been a good conference and enjoyable to be on this panel. To respond to your questions, Guy, I make 3 points. One, it was mentioned yesterday that corruption and governance issues are not unique to the Caribbean. And this is just incredibly true. The issue of corruption and governance has been around for an awful long time. I found a quote by Aesop, the fabulist in ancient Greece, and he stated that we hang the petty thieves and appoint the great ones to public office. It's an old quote, but depending on your political viewpoints, I'm sure people in many governments feel that way about their leaders. There's the scope and size of corruption is massive. According to the World Economic Forum, and this is back in 2018, the global cost of corruption is at least $2.6 trillion, or 5% of gross domestic product, the global economy. The World Bank estimates that business and individuals pay more than $1 trillion every year in bribes. And it's important to stress that this is not a problem just of developing economies. It's also an issue in advanced economies. Recently, if you look at the headlines, you saw in Malaysia, there was the 1MDB scandal in which the sovereign entity in Malaysia was involved in a huge bribery scam, asset misallocation that brought down the prime minister, who's probably going to spend most of his life in jail. But it was an extensive problem, and Goldman Sachs, who was involved in it, has to pay out, I think, around $3.9 billion in settlement and recovery of assets. Brazil, over the last few years, since 2014, had Operation Car Wash, Operação Lava Jato, that started off at Petrobras and it went to Odebrecht, the engineering company. It touched politicians, not just in Brazil, where it brought down former President Lula, who served time in jail, but helped bring down Dilma Rousseff, the president, through impeachment. But it also touched Peru, El Salvador, Colombia, and Panama. Certainly the US has had its share of scandals in the past. If you want to go back to the financial panic of 1792, which I'm sure everybody knows about. I say that, as a joke, but we had the Credit Mobilier, Teapot Dome, Lockheed Martin, the corporate sector. Of course, Bernie Madoff leaps out, Enron. And even though the US officially starts its independence in 1776, it was only in 1883 that we officially abandoned the spoils system in government with the Pendleton Act. passed by Chester Alan Arthur, who himself was a product of that system. The second point I'd like to make is poor governance and corruption has a cost. And I'm not talking just the $2.6 trillion, and this was brought up yesterday. It comes out in lost efficiency in government services, lost revenues to the government, a skewing of national wealth, political pollution, discouragement of talented individuals going into government services, and ultimately the bill is left to the citizens, and it ultimately erodes confidence in the legitimacy of democratic governments. And the third point is that there's a pushback in all this, and this is probably the most important message, and it certainly is reflected by having this webinar series, in that citizens, companies, investors are all pushing to have greater transparency and disclosure, greater accountability. You have intergovernmental organizations. This was brought up yesterday, and you brought up CARICOM and the Caribbean Court of Justice, but you also have things like the Caribbean Financial Task Force. The OECD is involved. The World Bank has the worldwide governance indicators, rating agencies, and even investors are in the process with what is called ESG, environment, social, and governance accountability. And this looks not just at governments, but it also looks at corporations. Do you want to do business with governments which have a checkered past, have issues in terms of corruption? So, you know, I think to answer, just to give the one word or the very, very short summary and kind of put this into context, corruption is a big issue. It's something we've dealt with for a long time, and the Caribbean is not unique in dealing with this.
Thank you so much, Scott. I'm going to turn, Tony, I'm going to turn to you. And I think Scott presented us with a great segue in terms of that third bucket, which he discussed, which was the pushback. You've done significant work on the matter of public governance and integrity for the oil and gas industry. I'm wondering if you could kind of set the stage for us as to what governments, NGOs, other international organizations, and even IOCs, these international oil companies, are doing to fight against corruption, specifically in the energy sector. And if maybe you can point us to examples of countries where measures have been particularly successful and perhaps where they have been less so. And then more generally, Tony, what is your assessment of the energy opportunities and the energy challenges that lay ahead for the Caribbean?
He's got a...
Tony, I believe you're muted.
Yeah, okay. All right, thank you very much, Guy. You want me to answer that in what, an hour or two, or just 5 minutes?
5 words.
Okay. My esteemed colleague and my esteemed colleague who is a connoisseur of fine Caribbean rums, I'm talking about Scott MacDonald. He made 3 points, I think, that are important for me. The first of all is that corruption is not unique to the Caribbean. It's a worldwide phenomenon. Secondly, it's not a developing country phenomenon. And thirdly, it's not just an energy phenomenon. I think we have to accept those principles before we start discussing them. As far as governance and integrity, public governance and integrity for oil, well, I think at a minimum, the basic principles of public governance and integrity as applicable to the management of oil revenues should be included in any revenue management law in any country, unless it's clearly addressed elsewhere. And there are 3 ingredients, I think, that are important, talking now about public governance. And that is anti-nepotism rules. They should be a part of any such law. Secondly, I think the mandated divestiture or liquidation of a public official's interests, that should be a part of it. Temporary and permanent limitations on how much you can examine So ideally for offshore oil provinces, new ones, such as Guyana and Suriname, the oil revenue management law should establish strict conflict of interest standards. These would prohibit government officials from holding interest in oil revenues. It would prevent them from representing any entity in which the oil revenue is deposited into the oil fund are held or invested. In Guyana's case, it's interesting. Their take from oil goes into the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So these ethics rules, I think, avoid unacceptable conflicts of interest. We've seen a lot of conflicts of interest, and believe it or not, Alaska, Azerbaijan, a number of other countries. So this, I think, is what is at least a basic rule for going ahead. The other area that's really critical, I think, is the one of public procurement. It's one of the areas in public governance most prone to corruption. So what has been coming around and being suggested is that oil revenue management laws should stipulate that any significant contract and agreement relating to oil revenues or to oil resources must be subject to open competitive public procurement. For example, Guyana's law should require that oil contracts be awarded pursuant to competitive public tenders in accordance with general legislation. Now, I start with talking about Guyana and possibly Suriname because they are now on the verge of trying to establish proper laws. I think Suriname is more advanced because it has had, a state company called Statsoli that has done a lot of PSCs, it has experience in the oil industry. Guyana has none whatsoever, and so it's trying to establish. But what is difficult to predict, and I want to close on this with the public thing. What is difficult to predict is what a subsequent government will do. What it will do about contractual obligations and so on. Sovereignty means that any law passed by a current government is in principle subject to amendment or repeal by any future government. Now, perhaps measures can be taken legislatively that may make it difficult to change a law. But this is a difficult one to enforce or predict. Constitutional amendments or trusts have been tried in some countries. But the point is that it is a very, very difficult thing to predict whether, even though a government maintains full control of a fund, the stability of a fund could also be enhanced by the involvement of regional or international institutions such as the World Bank. I'm sure there are people on this panel, and I'm thinking of Rayah, who's going to talk about the EITI, and Bruce, who obviously knows more about corporate law than all of us put together. So that pretty much deals with the public part of it. The other part of it, Guy, just very briefly, is that oil companies themselves fall into anti-bribery trouble very, very often. If you look at any of the investigative agencies, whether it's the EITI, whether it's any of those that Transparency International, whatever you will, the simple answer is that they fall into anti-bribery trouble for understandable reasons. First of all, many oil and gas companies are under some sort of corruption-related scrutiny. At last count, I think the FCPA blog, for example, there were 28 Foreign Corrupt Practices Act investigations into the oil sector in 2018. Although the FCPA investigations haven't been made public, I think it's fair to say that dozens of oil companies are under investigations. Why are they at such high risk? Let me just throw out 3 reasons. First of all, oil and gas projects are enormously complex. They involve components such as exploration, drilling, service support, transportation, marketing, and each component means there's another business partner, and each partner can pose corruption risk to the whole. Secondly, in emerging markets, oil and gas assets are controlled by state-owned companies. So these employees at those state-run companies, and Bruce can correct me on this if I'm wrong, I think they qualify as foreign government officials under the FCPA and other anti-bribery statutes. So the chance that the oil and gas business will encounter a foreign official is high. And thirdly, local and operational requirements in those markets can be exacted. For example, a Western Energy IOC, International Oil Company, might be required to partner with a local business in the emerging market to extract oil. Or you may have to source capital equipment locally in order to keep costs low. So what it does is create an opportunity for local officials to extract bribes, rig contracts, engage in other corruption. So these 3 factors, complex projects with many business partners, frequent contact with foreign government officials, and daunting local regulatory and operational requirements. These are powerful brew, if you will, for corruption risk. So I mentioned all of that simply to say, when you're talking about corruption, certainly in the energy sector, you cannot cast the blame on any government. You can, in a developing country, for example, Scott has pointed out that that corruption nexus or those threads run right up into the most developed countries on earth. And secondly, you have to be aware of the pressure or the opportunities that are created for IOCs when they come into another country. This is a way of saying it is not a developing country phenomenon, and it is not just an energy phenomenon. That's where I'll leave it for now. When you want to come back, I think, on the question of where we are and opportunities and challenges for the Caribbean, I'll do that if you want it now or later.
Tony, we'll come back to you, don't worry. We'll move on to Rayah really quickly, but Tony, thank you so much for those comments. As I mentioned, I'll be monitoring the Q&A box, and I see already that you've generated a lot of questions with your great remarks. So you mentioned EITI, which Rayah obviously knows a ton about, and you've also mentioned these complex projects being part of this puzzle. And so, Rayah, I'm going to turn to you. In January, Apache Corp and French Total announced a major discovery of oil in offshore Suriname and a major reserve of natural gas. What are some of the major corruption risks in the extractive sector generally? And what role can the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, which for those who don't know, though I'm sure everybody on this call or most people on this call do know, represents the global standard for promoting open and accountable management of oil, gas, and mineral resources. What role can EITI play in preventing or reducing corruption in the extractive industries in Suriname?
All right. Well, I think Tony mentioned a lot of the major risk factors in the sector. I think what can also add is because not just the complexity, but also the enormous scope of these types of investments in the oil sector make it very attractive to cut corners, for example, because all you need to do, if you have 5,000 kilometers of pipe, if you just make that pipe 0.5 millimeter smaller than it should be, or half a meter, people won't notice, but it can save you millions of dollars potentially. So procurement processes, the lack of supervision is not there, the lack of quality control, that just the sheer scope of the investments make that even small changes in the way that the work is carried out can give rise to enormous profits for, let's say, for corrupt officials. To add to your specific question about EITI and Apache, at this stage, EITI won't be able to won't have a major role, let's say, in detecting corruption or preventing corruption as such, because EITI is the type of data that is produced by the EITI, which has to do a lot with contracts, licensing, etc. It happens after the fact. So it's, afterwards that they will have to provide data, they will have to provide facts. Of course, they know that beforehand, so it does have an effect that that because you know that somebody will be watching, because you know that you will have to provide a lot of licensing and contract data, that's kind of a deterrent for corruption. But there will always be loopholes and ways to present the data. But what EITI can do, and that's besides just the pure EITI reporting itself, is that because of EITI implementation, local institutions and organizations are more or less encouraged to work in a different way. The tax office now has to record tax data in a much more secure manner than beforehand. There have been certain countries, for example, where in the past, the tax office, everything was done by hand and on paper. And when EITI was introduced, it forced them to go digital. So a lot of the benefits from EITI come not from the EITI reporting itself, but from the changes in the way that the institutes for checks and balances work, and in the way they operate, and in the way they keep record, and the way they look at the extractive companies.
Great, thank you so much, Rayah. Bruce, I'm going to turn to you, and I think use that last point that Rayah just made in terms of the checks and balances and the institutional capacity as a way to pick your legal mind, so to speak. In terms of the legal framework in Suriname, as the expert lawyer on this panel, what is the situation with anti-corruption and governance? And can Suriname take any anti-corruption mitigation action directed specifically at natural resource extraction, such as oil? And maybe might it employ some sort of international anti-corruption law conventions?
Yes, there are a number of things that Suriname can do. On the international level, Suriname is not yet a member of the UN Anti-Corruption Convention. That's the major international convention that all countries have joined. Suriname is a member of the Inter-American Anti-Corruption Convention, which is useful. In terms of national legislation, the reports have said that Suriname's criminal laws are very antiquated and need to be updated. In addition, last year, Suriname passed an anti-corruption law, but it hasn't yet been implemented. It would require disclosure by political officials of their income, their assets, and their wealth. Once this is implemented, that will help in terms of transparency, although 2 countries in the Caribbean have this legislation right now, or 3 of them do, the Bahamas, Jamaica, and Guyana. And those laws haven't worked very well, partly because they haven't been well financed and the compliance hasn't been good. But nevertheless, when Suriname implements the anti-corruption law, and when it has the anti-corruption commission, which hasn't yet been established to implement it, that will help in terms of transparency. Suriname can do a lot more too in terms of its institutional mechanisms providing capacity for the institutions that do mining and natural resource extraction. And then finally, there needs to be much more engagement of civil society groups, such as Rayah's groups, that can provide a role in terms of reporting on revenue and reporting on conflicts of interest in different issues. So there needs to be more of a role for both civil society and the media.
Thanks so much, Bruce. I think that's a good segue to a question that I have for Scott, and it's incorporating some of the comments that you made at the top, Scott, but specifically this last piece that Bruce mentioned, more engagement with civil society as a means to provide reporting on conflicts of interest and a bunch of other areas. At the top, in your opening remarks, you mentioned ESG, that there is this growing trend in international investment for environmental, social, and governance, which is used by socially conscious investors to screen projects, kind of as a function of how it maintains relationships with its communities and kind of governance and internal controls. Should Caribbean countries and companies involved in the region care about ESG? And would this put the Caribbean on a stabler path, perhaps, to good governance?
It's a very good question. I mean, I think the future of global investment is going to be dominated by ESG. The movement, I mean, I've been in the financial industry for a long period of time. 1990s, it wasn't on the screen. You had green bonds, they came in the 2000s, but this stuff gradually has picked up momentum. And there's a lot of concern over sustainability of projects, what is the impact on climate change, but it all goes back to the governance issue. That does a government or does a country like Suriname or Guyana take care of their forest resources? If a timber company is to go in there, are they going to pay attention to replanting? Are they going to pay attention to the environment? Same thing with mining companies. You have a lot of gold mining companies throughout the Caribbean and Guyana and Suriname in particular. Are they meeting the specifications that will leave the environment not terribly polluted, and preferably not polluted? There's cases of mercury dumping in a number of rivers in the region. But these issues, the ESG issues, are here to stay, and there's going to be growth in it. And I think it does send a message, not just to the governments in the region, and to kind of go back to Tony Bryan's comments about governments, companies. It's important for companies to pay attention to this because they have to. Shareholders are paying closer attention. You're going into country A, it has a dictatorial regime, it's got a bad human rights background, it's got a high level of corruption, it ranks poorly with transparency and disclosure, and Moody's, Standard & Poor's all mention the political and governance issue in their reports. So there's definitely a pushback on this, and I think for the Caribbean going forward, where you have ideas about the blue economy, the use of maritime resources, climate change concerns, all this fits into this package of ESG. And I think it's something that people in the Caribbean, governments as well as businesses and parts of civil society are going to need to pay more attention to because it benefits them to do so.
I'd also like to add on to that.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So besides companies, because the situation that Bruce is describing is more applicable for international companies that already have a lot of international regulations and codes of conduct and international standards that they adhere to. But the situation that you have, I think, in Suriname and Guyana and in some other, definitely probably some other countries as well. For example, in Suriname and Guyana, you have the gold sector. Suriname has a lot of small and medium scale gold mining companies, which are mostly locally financed. So you know, even if the international banks and international investors really have this growing awareness of ESG, the local financial institutions don't have that yet. We as Projekta did a small study into this last year for a lobby and advocacy program that we had wanted to start specifically on ESG. And the situation is really that because local banks, you know, their business is giving loans, and that's how they survive. They give loans, they make profit off the interest that they get from the loans. And they say that their main concern is a company able to pay back? You have a few financial institutions that say, okay, we have a certain principle. We will not loan money to a company that does, for example, small scale gold mining. But a lot of the financial institutions say that, you know, we're not in the position to be able to pick and choose what loans we can give to, and we're not in the position to be able to monitor what a loan is used for, because a company can say, for example, we want this loan to pay for a new office building, for example, and then they will use that money to buy more heavy machinery for to mine in the interior where nobody can see what they do anyway. So I think that when talking about ESG, it's also really important to make this distinction in the international financial institutions and the smaller local banks, local and possibly even regional banks that just don't have that capacity and that incentive yet. They want to. I mean, they've spoken to us about how they do realize the importance of ESG, but they just don't have the capacity to monitor that.
Yeah, if I could just add a couple of things. Increasingly, there is a lot of pressure for multinational corporations to have corporate social responsibility and to have supply chains to show that whether it's minerals, whether it's timber, that those are extracted in compliance with both national and international laws. And increasingly, the World Bank, the OECD, the UN are providing both carrots and sticks. And you also have increasingly environmental, non-governmental organizations that are doing undercover sting operations and exposing non-compliance. They're producing, 150-page reports with videos and putting pressure on law enforcement in the United States to go after the companies that are violating national and international law. So I think this ESG pressure is going to continue.
Tony, I think your mic is muted.
Right, thank you. I have a question for Bruce, actually. There's no way, all of the institutions that we're talking about, international organizations, governments, NGOs, they're all committed to fighting against corruption. This is admirable. But in the energy sector, I think we're still very far away from defeating corruption or even curbing it. So Bruce, what interests me is, while anti-corruption actions at the global or regional level appear to be preferable to the national ones, perhaps the criminal law approach is something that is highly inefficient for the purpose of preventing corporate crime and specifically corruption. So I think if you accept that thesis for a minute or reject it, is there a compelling need to develop alternative legal instruments and regulatory measures to fight this kind of corporate crime?
Yes, I think there's no one measure that's going to succeed. I mean, on the one hand, I think criminal law plays a role but you also need, for instance, the transparency in the role of civil society and the media in order to involve citizenry. And so the citizens of any country like Suriname is going to know what the flow of payments are from, foreign companies. And they're going to, if they have this, once the disclosure law goes into force and it's effectively implemented, people in Suriname will know when politicians suddenly have a large increase in their salary that is disproportionate. I mean, a large increase in their income that's disproportionate to their salary. So I think transparency, and as you said, Tony, better procurement laws will also help bring better governance and better transparency. So, and they will supplement what the criminal law tries to do.
Right, I'm glad you came around to that, because I think one of the important principles we're starting to realize is that transparency and public support for that transparency is one of the things that is very important. The only problem there, is that multinational corporations will continue to impose transparency rules on their companies. But if they are more stringent than the ones applicable, to national laws, is there a bit of a discrepancy there? Is it going to continue to be, neutralized? I don't know exactly how to phrase it, but you don't want to slip back into the old days where multinational corporations corrupted with impunity to secure profitable contracts. So the legislation or the legal things that are designed, as you are suggesting, probably they all need to be bolstered by strict transparency and public support and interest in that transparency. I think that might be the key to some of this.
Exactly. So what has been done in the deforestation area is that environmental NGOs have engaged with developing countries to develop a platform that everyone can see. And what happens is the timber companies have to agree to voluntarily participate so that the NGOs and the citizens of the world can see where all the fees are, that the licenses are properly obtained. And, that is a way to bring proper transparency into the supply chain so that when there are violations, people both in the developing country where the forests are and the consumers, they can all see that, for instance, if you're buying a violin, you can see that the wood that you're using has a proper supply chain and that it's legal timber, legal under the country where it was taken from, and that it doesn't violate CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species.
Thank you, Bruce.
If I could just add in a couple points here. I think where we've kind of taken the conversation is that for this to change, pressure has to come from both civic society in the particular countries as well as external pressures. And there's the old expression about, if you have more eyes looking at the same thing, this way when the tide goes out, you can tell who's wearing a bathing suit and who isn't. And this is kind of what I think we've reached into is, okay, we are still going to have corruption, but it's going to be more difficult to do that going forward. One of the more controversial issues we haven't touched on, but I know Bruce has an opinion on this, is the issue of money laundering and de-risking in the Caribbean, where the OECD countries have had the so-called blacklist or gray list. They've penalized various governments in the Caribbean in terms of their banking environments or offshore financial facilities, but also the de-risking where pressure from regulators within the US, Canada, Japan, and Europe have pushed a lot of banks, international banks, to pull out of the Caribbean. And the cost here has been huge in terms of if you are mom and dad and you're going to send your daughter off to university in Toronto, you have to go to a bank to get it done. And a lot of banks may or may not have correspondent banking relationships. So your choice of doing this is narrowed down. Or if you're in Belize, you don't even have that option. You probably have to go through the central bank because international banks have pulled out. So I think where the conversation here has gone in terms of the oil industry, which may be a little more broader gauge, but certainly in terms of forestry, there's more eyes watching what's being done. And the more eyes that are on these issues, it's going to be more difficult to avoid compliance and disclosure.
Yeah, and one of the problems with respect to de-risking and money laundering has been the small size of the Caribbean makes it difficult for the Caribbean to enforce a level playing field. So you see, for instance, the Caribbean has lost a lot of its financial services market to South Dakota, Wyoming, Nevada, and Delaware, because while the US beat up the rest of the world on the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, the US doesn't do automatic exchange of information under the common, under the CRS that the OECD has established. And also the US is non-compliant with entity transparency and gatekeeper. So you see a lot of the wealth in the world has flown from the Caribbean to the US, and it's difficult for the Caribbean to enforce the level playing field.
Bruce, I'd like to ask, this is a audience question. That some Caribbean countries have integrity in public life legislation or laws similar to that. Many have also signed both the UN and the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, yet corruption is still prevalent in some of these countries. Can you speak a bit to the sort of enforcement mechanisms that might be required to give teeth to these instruments and the role, I know we've touched upon this before, but the role of civil society and maybe how these governments can interact with civil society in a way that is not only transparent, but that builds trust and integrity within a good governance framework?
Yeah, those are good questions. It's both a problem of laws and also enforcement mechanisms. About 7 or 8 years ago, the Commonwealth Secretariat tried to help by having some conferences informing integrity commissions within the region. And also the Commonwealth Secretariat facilitated work with the attorneys generals to have a group focus on anti-corruption. However, there hasn't really been any follow-up. And here you would hope that there would be more done by CARICOM itself, because under the CARICOM agreement, it provides for meetings of the attorneys general. And you would think that the attorneys general in CARICOM would have a body on anti-corruption and would have more uniform legislation, more uniform approaches to corruption, and as well as engagement of civil society.
Rayah, I want to ask you a question that's building actually off of an audience question, but also a question that I have myself. So gold, we know, is also a pillar of Suriname's economy, which accounts for over 70% of exports. But there too, we see this question of transparency. We see it in terms of handing out lucrative concessions to certain entities and perhaps not to others. The audience question is, what is your organization doing to function as a watchdog for small to medium scale mineral mining sector and to make sure that these entities adhere to international regulations?
Well, we're not exactly a watchdog in the, well, we are a watchdog organization, but not active in the field as such, that we are in the interior ourselves, that we can see, environmental and social damage firsthand. But what we primarily do is that we have two main functions. One is more that we create platforms for dialogue and for example, for the voices of indigenous and tribal peoples organizations to be heard, because they are the ones that are, the, the communities in the interior that feel the effects of what's happening in the sector and the damage. So what we try to do is that, for example, within EITI, we have always advocated for and been able to realize that there are always two spaces for indigenous and tribal peoples organizations on the multi-stakeholder group. So no matter what, those two seats are guaranteed. So that's an example of the, let's say, the bridge function that we have. And what we also do is that we try to find every space, every opportunity or space that we can to lobby for legislation that would make the watchdog function for civil society easy to do, because our civil society's role is a watchdog role, but without, for example, freedom of information legislation, it's really, really difficult to get a lot of things done, because we don't have any more information than the government agencies do. So without information, not all types of corruption is something that you can see physically. If there are things that you can see physically, then you can act on it. But other types of corruptions is if you are able to get access to documents, get access to information, only then you can act and be a whistleblower, for example. So that's kind of really the difficult position that civil society is in, is that you are expected to be a watchdog and you try your best, but without that enabling environment, then it's difficult to do that.
Tony, I'd like to turn it to you and maybe kind of push us into the future, even just in the short or medium term, and kind of how you see things developing in recent years. Not only because of recent discoveries of oil and gas in Suriname, Guyana, but an audience member asks, what do you perceive of the role China might play in the energy space in the Caribbean, particularly with Venezuela's continued downturn and the need for energy resources there? If you could, at a very high level, where do you see things going? Do you think on a lot of the issues that we've talked about today, do you see us progressing in the coming years, or do you see us running into more obstacles?
He's got to put his mic on.
With respect to corruption, you're talking about.
Yeah, with respect to corruption.
Yeah. Well, as the Portuguese used to say, la luta continua, we're carrying on. And it's difficult to really predict where we wind up, because, Rayah made an interesting point. She didn't spell it out like that, but I will. There are two levels of corruption, we're talking about bribery, ordinary bribery, and then we're talking about grand corruption. Grand corruption is where, it is such a high level that it really impacts on the welfare of the state. I don't think any of our Caribbean countries are in that latter category of grand corruption. At least I haven't found it as yet. With respect to the future of the energy sector, before the current crisis, there was a very positive outlook for the energy sector in the Caribbean. We're talking about new discoveries in deep water off Guyana, Suriname, and incidentally, I might mention off of Trinidad and Tobago continuously, but the fields in Trinidad and Tobago tend to be more gas prone than oil sufficient. So Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados, which produces, I think, about 1,600 barrels of oil daily from a small collection of land wells. This has really begun to create a future. It is a situation in which the Southern Caribbean, starting from Barbados and going down to Suriname, is really a new axis of oil and gas in the Caribbean. And it's going to take a fairly long time for, renewable energy to replace the need for oil and gas. That's sometime in the future. So we have to live with that. We have to live with the fact that there is a place for oil and gas in the blue economy of the Caribbean. There's a place for oil and gas in the green economy of the Caribbean. And the key to success, I think, is the effective management of the sector. It's perhaps appropriate to say that China presents both an opportunity and a risk. Certainly, China's coming to the assistance of Venezuela. Is not alone. Russia is there as well. Some of those heavy crude areas in the Orinoco, they can't go ahead without Chinese or Russian involvement and investment. So in the Caribbean context, there are different players. At one time, the only player in town was Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and the Petrocaribe program. That has now receded into oblivion. Maduro has no more strength, at least in terms of the oil and gas economy. So the mantle has passed then. I think the geopolitical focus now is really on Guyana. It is on Suriname. It is on Trinidad and Tobago. And certainly its relationship between Barbados, Grenada, and others who are exploring for oil. And exploration is going on. It hasn't slowed down. So as I say, it's a new axis of oil and gas development in the region. I think on the negative side, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that given the Saudi-induced oil collapse of some time ago, the impact of COVID-19 on tourism, and a world that seems to be moving towards recession and diminished global confidence, the Caribbean is not going to be immune from any economic shocks, and it will require significant economic and social adjustments. Ad interim, the Caribbean nations that import oil and gas are likely to benefit from lower prices, but that is not likely to compensate for the fall in visitor arrivals in tourism, for example, and attendant taxes. So what we have come to the conclusion in Trinidad is that in the current circumstance, oil and gas are no longer the panaceas for economic development and or to combat economic distress as we see it. The emphasis has to be on other things. And every government in this region, including my own in Trinidad here and Tobago, is faced with this dilemma. How to stimulate the economy without going into further debt, how to stimulate it without having to rely excessively on oil and gas. In that kind of open space, one can expect that China will see some advantages, as will others.
Scott, I know you've written about this fairly recently, actually, for Global Americans, about the fact that the Caribbean needs to access international financial markets and foreign direct investments, but that obviously it is a competitive world and there are other countries seeking many of the same sources of capital. Particularly considering this bleak global outlook that Tony just described, that has led to the evaporation of a lot of international capital markets. How does the Caribbean stand up in this regard, both kind of in the short term and the medium term? And how big is the risk to sustainable flow of remittances? I'm speaking mainly about remittances now from North America to the Caribbean. How big of a risk is there? And what role might rating agencies play in terms of focusing attention from this kind of the financial markets to governance issues and other things of the sort?
Thanks, Guy, for the very simple question. I'd like to kind of segue that from Tony's comments too on China in the region. I mean, first and foremost, Tony mentioned that China is more opportunity than risk. And I think pretty much through the course of China's engagement or its recharged engagement in the Caribbean, starting off 2005 to where we are today, China's come as a very important economic partner for the region. They have been willing to provide loans for the region as a source of capital, international capital. They have met the need of a lot of infrastructure projects that were long bottlenecked for not having funds out of the West. 2008 financial crisis hit the global economy very hard. It hit advanced economies very hard, and it shortened or reduced the amount of money available for capital to go into places like the Caribbean. The sort of issues that come out of all this, though, is as we've gone through 2008 to, I'd say 2019, before COVID, you did see foreign investment from the US, from Europe, Japan, as well as China going into the region. That was important. Capital markets were definitely open for the region, and countries like Grenada, other ones were able to restructure their debt, but there was access to some of these markets, the private sector part of the market. The question going forward for the Caribbean, and this includes the I would say the new Cold War between the United States and China in the Caribbean, is how do we parcel out capital now, and what directly related to that, what type of economic policies do we want to follow through with? And this goes from the issue with COVID, that tourism got hit very hard. Tony mentioned that it's a limited sense of direction as to where energy is going, that we're moving away from hydrocarbons to other options. This poses a real point, I think, for the Caribbean for a rethink. This includes the issue of corruption and governance, but it also takes a look at economic models. Things like food security have to come into play here. Climate change, I mentioned earlier, the blue economy, all these things have to be reconsidered. And I think without that deep reconsideration, how does the Caribbean take advantage of the disentanglement between the US and Chinese economies? We went through this period from the 1980s to about 2017 of globalization. Now we're pulling back on globalizations, reconfiguring global supply chains. The Caribbean can benefit from this. And the Caribbean does have resources, especially things, areas like agriculture and even forestry that could be better managed to deal with a lot of these issues. So it's, I would say, rating agencies play a big role in this because they define how creditors are going to look at lending money to the region. And international capital markets have deep pockets. Anyone growing up in the US, interest rates are low. People are looking for yield. This takes them to riskier credits, which some of the Caribbean countries represent. There is a market for products out of the Caribbean, but without better ratings, without a reconfiguration of thought and ideas to sustainability of development, it's going to be more of a challenge for Caribbean countries to get back into private capital markets.
Rayah, I'd like to take this sustainability piece that Scott mentioned at the end of his comments just now and turn it over to you, incorporating a question actually from an audience member, which is overall, what are countries in the region doing in order to not fall into the quote unquote resource curse between resource abundance and poor economic performance? Do you have any foresight to what countries are doing things well, how they're interacting maybe with CARICOM and the OAS to make natural resources a blessing rather than a curse?
I don't have insight into what a lot of the Caribbean countries are doing, but I think one important tool is, for example, savings and stabilization fund. I don't know if that's the correct English term for it, sovereign wealth fund. But sovereign wealth funds can be an important instrument into increasing sustainability for natural resources. But as in a lot of other legislation that we've discussed today, the trick is that to not just adopt that legislation, but to also really implement it. For example, Suriname has a sovereign wealth fund, but it's not really operational as such. Well, yeah, it is, but that's the most important thing, to not just pass the laws to adopt these funds, but to really implement it. I think that could be one really important tool that countries can use.
Great. And Bruce, I don't know if you'd like to comment on that, maybe kind of this intersection, if you will, between institutional capacity and opportunities for procurement and how corruption makes its way into that nexus.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that a lot of the Caribbean, especially Suriname, could do is improve its institutional capacity. So, and the way that it can do that is trying to obtain technical and financial assistance, both from international organizations and also NGOs. So, and especially its critical institutions like NEMOS, like the Attorney General's Office, the Department of Finance, I should say Ministry of Finance, and there, I mean, everything from the IMF, World Bank, national governments give technical assistance, and also groups like the Basel Institute of Governance will help strengthen institutions and will help with looking at procurement laws and revising them so that they're more transparent. So, I mean, I think that's what the Caribbean can do. Also, by joining, one of the things that Suriname hasn't done yet is it's not a member of the Egmont group of financial intelligence units. If Suriname would join the Egmont group, it would also get, it would also upgrade its anti-money laundering standards and derive the benefit of the other financial intelligence units, both in the region and outside of the region.
Thanks, Bruce. Tony, I have a question for you. If you were to advise policymakers here in the United States as to how to engage with the region in this context, from the energy space, in a way that is promoting good governance and sustainability, what would that advice sound like?
I am like number 4 on the candidates list for the presidency. So no, that's a very challenging one. Who am I to tell the policymakers in the US what to do? I always started with a premise since graduate school, you know, which is that there should be a certain amount of respect for your neighbors. There should be a certain amount of respect in terms of recognizing that there are traditions that they have that may be, of course, important. One of the tools I would use, obviously, would be the Caribbean diaspora. It has now, I mean, I was looking the other day, the two of the candidates for vice president on Biden's team, I understand, maybe Kamala Harris and Susan Rice. Both of them are people who have Caribbean heritage in very recent times, like their parents or grandparents. I look around the vast bureaucracy in Washington. It changes, of course, and someone like David Lewis is probably in a better position to talk about this. But there are so many areas in which lobbying on behalf of the Caribbean can proceed and can take place. So I think that aspect of influence, excuse me, respect, lobbying processes, it's all about power. It's all about how you translate power into influence. And from my opinion, I mean, I'm old enough now to think that it cannot be a one-way street. I can't pin down in response to your question, Guy, whether there are very specific things that I would want to do. If I said that, it will change in November. So, you know, it's not an easy thing to answer. Others may have some point of view, but I think I tend to weigh heavily on the idea of some sort of equality in negotiating, some sort of lobbying and respect for it, and certainly using the influence of the Caribbean diaspora to our benefit.
So another thing the Caribbean diaspora can do is develop financing. Through transnational philanthropy, the Caribbean diaspora can supplement some of the initiatives of the governments, whether it be in healthcare, you know, helping with hospitals, helping in the area of culture, helping, for instance, Barbados is trying to do a national gallery of art, and there's undoubtedly going to be transnational philanthropy helping there. So, you know, that's an area where the Caribbean diaspora can help is in terms of financing different projects in the region.
Bruce, you're absolutely right. And one would hope that it would be so. Experience, I think, has taught me that sometimes there is sufficient pushback from the local community on things like that. When I look around the region, I realize that the Jamaicans are probably the ones who are far more acceptable to a heavy role from the diaspora. I think I see that in Barbados as well. I do not see it in my own country of Trinidad and Tobago. There is a kind of attitude here that, you know, we stand alone. We do what we have to do. We have indigenous institutions and we rely on them. So, you know, as I say, it's a pushback sometimes. But in general, the idea that you put forward is very, very important.
I think one of the roles too for Global Americans and other groups would be to look at what has been done between the Caribbean diaspora in North America and the Caribbean, and to develop, you know, reports or, you know, books in order to encourage and facilitate more of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great segue into not only me pushing folks to look at our website again, where we've done a report on that, but also me making the announcement that a lot of the findings and discussions that we're having here today are ultimately going to be converted into a report by many of these distinguished panelists, both from today and yesterday. I'm wondering, we're nearing 11:15 right now, Eastern time. I'm wondering if anyone has kind of high-level closing thoughts before we wrap up, and whether it's related to a forward-looking perspective regarding the region, or if there's something that somebody said previously that they wanted to address and didn't have the chance to.
Would you like me to go first?
Yeah, go for it, Tony.
Okay. With all that we have discussed, you know, concerning the management of the sector, efforts to prevent corruption and so on, let me just make one proviso there. The best laid plans are useless unless they're implemented. And I think Rayah tried to bring that out in her earlier discussion. For me, I think in managing this problem of corruption in the energy sector, and I stress managing, there is very little reason to assume that we can, you know, obliterate it completely. I think the three areas would be oversight, transparency, and timely information for the public about how those income flows and expenditures are managed. For example, Guyana will prosper if the massive revenue quickly transforms the economy and the quality of life for its citizens. But it's off to a bloody bad start. That political crisis, I mean, has already started to, you know, deter investment. Not that the oil companies can live with that. They can certainly live with that. But the Guyanese population is suffering, they're losing revenue and all the rest of it. One of the interesting points is that the agreements between Exxon, for example, and the Guyanese government have not really been made public, nor have they been explained in any fashion that would satisfy some sort of public investigation. So I think all the tools are there. As I say, oversight, transparency, timely information for the public, and we will manage. But again, the best laid plans are useless unless they're implemented.
Scott?
Yeah, I just want to reinforce part of what Tony is saying, but also I make three closing points. One, the Caribbean consists of a group of small countries. One of the issues that's often faced is limited human resources or human capital to deal with a lot of these issues. The Caribbean does have mechanisms like CARICOM, the Caribbean Court of Justice, the Caribbean Development Bank. There has been disappointment, I know, with CARICOM, but I think this is something that needs to be re-examined, and these organizations are meant to pool resources and to leverage power. And the Caribbean, like I said, they're small states in an ocean of much larger countries they have to deal with. And I think Tony touched on this point too, but I think it should be emphasized, is the issue of political will. Suriname's prospects look much better than they have for a long time. You've had a change of government that was very important, and it looks like the political will there is ready for a change, and a civic society that is also willing for change. In Guyana, you've reached another crossroads. Another country, just to pull out of the Guyanas, another country though that made a big change and political will was behind it is Jamaica. Jamaica's done a lot of work to restructure its economy, suffered a lot of social pain, but the Jamaican economy is probably in a better position than it's been in a long time. And the last point is the Caribbean faces a bigger, more politicized world than it was the last decade. The US has returned to being a more active participant in the region, and that has pluses as well as negatives. But you're also, like I said, you have US companies and investors looking over the region, European companies, Japanese, and Chinese. And there are a lot of choices the Caribbean nations are going to have to make going forward. Going to good governance, going to honesty, going to transparency. transparency are better paths for the region to follow going forward, I think. That's my humble opinion.
Thanks, Scott. Bruce?
He's got a,
Yeah, I don't have anything further really to contribute. I think, as Scott and Tony have said, the region is under a lot of pressure, and it's going to be important for them to look increasingly to the institutions that they have, and to do so with sustainability by developing proper governance and transparency in the different development initiatives that they'll pursue.
Great. And Rayah?
Yeah, just maybe a quick addition. I also agree with what the previous speakers have said, but also that we shouldn't forget to not just think about formal preventive and repressive measures, but also don't forget important things like, civic education, general awareness about what is corruption, what are the causes, what are the effects, because only then will you will really increase your chances. Because if nobody knows what corruption is and everybody thinks it's an okay thing to do, then the most fabulously drafted laws and fancy enforcement mechanisms are not going to get you very far.
Thank you so much. So we've gone a little bit over the time that we asked folks to reserve for this event. So I'm going to move to the closing here and really thank everybody, not just for today's event, but for yesterday's event as well. We want to thank all of the panelists. We want to thank everybody who was in attendance. This is one of many webinars that Global Americans will be rolling out in the coming weeks. So please look to our website, which is again, theglobalamericains.org. I'd also like to announce, and first of all, I would like to thank Mavrick for all of his work on this, and to announce that we're going to be doing another collaboration with Mavrick and with the U.S. Embassy in Suriname in the coming months on good governance in Latin America. And if you enjoyed the conversation today, we would again encourage you to go to our website, sign up for our weekly newsletter, where you'll get a concise summary of developments in the region once a week, every Friday, so we won't be bombarding your inboxes. And as I mentioned at the top, if you enjoyed this analysis from these experts, we're going to be working with them in the coming weeks to publish working papers on these issues, which again will be published on our website. So please stay tuned. Please check out the Caribbean Corner on our website. And it has been an extraordinary honor to share the virtual stage with these distinguished panelists and to bask in all the work that they've done and are continuing to do in the hemisphere. So to all listening, please stay safe, please stay well. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.